As the federal government attempted to salvage the nation's economy following the Great Depression, a pivotal act shielded millions of workers from brutal work hours, insufficient pay, as well as the merciless exploitation of their children. On June 25, 1938, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which, although strongly protested, remains one of the most critical laws for America's workers. Throughout the many compromises and failures of this act, no one could have anticipated the massive impact it would continue to have on the nation's development more than 80 years later. For decades, national laws regulating the treatment of employees were declared unconstitutional, even dictatorial, as refugees fled from Eastern Europe to escape political oppression. An abundance of industrial jobs drew them to America. As the number of workers increased exponentially, business owners found that they could pay mere pennies to the employees that worked all day in order to maximize their profits. The workers often brought their children to their jobs, and their employers quickly realized that they could pay their children even less for a full day's labor. And these children could also perform delicate work that proved difficult for the adults. Excruciating work hours, meager pay, and the ruthless profiteering off of children began to spiral out of control without any recognition of the dire working conditions for a multitude of American workers. However, many people's views changed after March 25, 1911, the date of the tragic Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, considered to be one of the deadliest industrial disasters in the history of the United States. Due to unsafe working conditions and locked exits, a perfectly containable and preventable fire resulted in 146 deaths and 78 injuries. More than 20 years later, in 1933, was when the first success in this extensive struggle, the National Industrial Recovery Act, was developed as part of the New Deal. The act focused on establishing a national minimum wage, maximum hours for a work week, and a minimum age for employee. Businesses that agreed to these terms were given a blue eagle to display, and patriotic Americans were told only to support these establishments. Unfortunately, on May 27, 1935, only 2 years later, the act was disarmed. Opponents claimed that the act resulted in the government acting dictatorially, and that businesses should be able to regulate their own wages and hours. They argued that certain industries should be exempted from the act due to the nature of the work. Ultimately, the fact that most businesses were not upholding the minimum age for employees resulted in the act's downfall. Since children could be paid less and didn't form unions, child labor was popular among corporations in spite of the New Deal. This resulted in unclean, unsafe, and extremely hazardous working conditions for children as young as 3 or 4. In fact, in 1910, nearly 2 million children under the age of 15 were working in industrial jobs. Their childhoods were being torn from their hands and replaced with deadly machinery that would regularly result in injuries or fatalities. Eventually, in his 1936 presidential campaign, President Roosevelt, while voicing his criticism of the Supreme Court for not addressing these issues, promised to pass legislation in order to cover the issues presented in the National Industrial Recovery Act in a more competent manner. He stated, "It seems to me to be equally plain that no business which depends for existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country." After his landslide victory, he upheld his guarantees by appointing 6 additional judges in the Supreme Court. After the failure of the National Industrial Recovery Act, Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor and the first woman to serve in the presidential cabinet, revealed to Roosevelt that she had 2 emergency bills in order to achieve fair labor standards for America's workers. She informed Roosevelt that the bills could be considered unconstitutional in their present political climate, to which they both agreed that the bills would have to be unorthodox to enact substantial change. Their first emergency bill, simply containing a national minimum wage, did not succeed due to the fact that the government actually encouraged employers to exploit their laborers in order to achieve a lower price. In 1935, nearly 40% of the government contractors, employing over 1.5 million workers, did not meet any of the standards previously stated in the National Industrial Recovery Act. After the failure of the first bill, President Roosevelt then asked Perkins, What happened to that nice unconstitutional bill that you tucked away? The bill, however, was not put to a fair vote in the House, and the Congress adjourned without any action. Roosevelt then addressed Congress, stating to business owners that the government would not have total control over their businesses, increasing the support of the public. Francis Perkins and Roosevelt continued to simplify the bill until the Ramspeck Compromise was ready to present to Congress again. This needed to be watered down even more and presented to the House again, replacing the Wage Board with an administrator and an advising committee for the specific cases that would be exempted from the regulations. The bill, after multiple further compromises, was voted on May 24, 1938, and passed by a landslide. Once the bill reached Congress, 72 further amendments worked to weaken it. The compromise was then signed by the President, and the Fair Labor Standards Act would become effective on October 24, 1938. Throughout the past 84 years, there have been multiple amendments and changes to this act, such as raising the minimum wage to $7.25 per hour. But the act remains as a baseline to protect the freedoms of America's workers. The Fair Labor Standards Act remains one of the most remarkable triumphs for workers in America. Despite numerous barriers and various failures, the law finally succeeded, benefiting millions of people. Throughout multiple decades, as the public began lobbying for increased workers' rights, the Fair Labor Standards Act has served as a precedent for dozens of cases that have further expanded workers' freedoms. Such improvements include the case of IPB Inc. versus Alvarez, which amended the FLSA to require employers to pay their employees for the time that was spent preparing for the job, such as gathering equipment. The numerous compromises that were involved in the ratification of this act allowed for the integration of multiple perspectives to produce a final product that would benefit all workers in America. As President Roosevelt said, "It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something." The countless failures and compromises were instrumental to the success of the decades-long struggle for the entire American working class, establishing the Fair Labor Standards Act.